In a previous video I mentioned I quite liked how Cooldeep mounted the bearing on this panther router here, but because I didn't know how to mount a bearing on the end of a steel shaft, I kept my wooden panther router with the bearing mounted on a block like this, where you just changed a block to change the size of the guide bearing. Well, that prompted all kinds of suggestions for how I could mount a bearing on the end of a shaft, like using Loctite for example. I guess I should have been a bit more specific, because there's no amount of Loctite that'll make this fit or make that shaft go into here. So what I really need is some kind of bushing to make that bearing fit. So I started going through my junk bin to see what I could find, and I found all kinds of 6mm shafts. This one already had a black piece of plastic on there and I just cut it off. This one just uses a bushing that I found is just a 6mm size. Here's another one with a bushing on there. This one was a roller from some piece of equipment. And even mounting this bearing on here, I could do that by grinding a shaft down a little bit to make that bearing fit. I could never quite grind this precisely enough to get a tight fit on here, but using bits of aluminum from a pop can, I can just shim it. And now it's an interference fit. Another method is just to cut a thread on the end of the shaft with a tap and die set. And then I can put stuff on there, for instance, like this IKEA type nut, and that is round on itself already, so that could be a follower. Or I could use the round shank here as a follower, or maybe even grind it down to fit a bearing like this. I could also just put a regular hex nut on the end of the shaft and grind that down to act as a follower too. So this one, after some polishing, came out to about 11mm in size, and it's actually surprisingly quite round. This 26mm bearing I mounted by taking a bushing and gluing that onto the shaft, and the bushing is ground down to just about fit in here, but I still had to put a shim in there to make it fit. So with this one I'd have to use a similar method, or I could use this part which just happens to fit precisely in here, and it's got the 6mm inside hole, so I could shim and glue this all together, but I don't actually need to, because I already have two followers of that same size from Cooldeep, and what he did is he just bought a bearing that already had a 6mm hole in it. Another thing you can do is you can expand the size of the bearing or the shaft by wrapping UHMW tape around it, and this tape is really tough. You actually have to peel this layer off to get the sticky layer, and each turn you put on will actually add about 0.3mm to the diameter. I wouldn't recommend it for a shim on the inside though, because it's really not that tough. You can also just start with a 1/4" bolt to make your followers, and for instance this nut with an integral washer on it, if I just put that on here, there's a ready-made follower, and this one is about 19mm. But with all the followers I've got here, I still haven't got one that's exactly 1 inch, so I'll make one of those out of wood next. So this one came out a tiny bit small, but I'll just put some UHMW tape around it to bring it up to size and make it slippery. So previously I mounted the follower bearings by just mounting a little block like this to the link with the handle on it on my panther router. But to mount all of these guys I needed something with a hole in it, so I made this guy here which mounts on there in exactly the same way, but it has a hole right here. And there's a bolt that goes from here through to here, and if I tighten this knob, that locks this in place. The next challenge is try to make some of these tapered templates where I can adjust the size of the tenon a little bit by how far in and out I move along here, and it's also got the slot in the middle for cutting a corresponding mortise. So I've already made this template here, and that worked out pretty good, and I want to make another one not quite as big but using even thicker stock. I've worked out how far I want the centers of the semicircles on the end to be apart, and I set the compass to be half the width of my stock. So let's just find the center with that. And I can also check that the compass is indeed the right radius. And let's draw that. So the next challenge is how to cut that slot in there so it's really straight and accurate. Well, it just so happens that my Panther router is a really awesome slot cutting machine, and I just set up a track here with 2 clamps as stops to cut that straight slot down here. Well, despite checking and checking again, I managed to put that slot just a little wee bit this way. But that's actually okay with me because I'm almost always putting a mortise into a piece that's wider than the rail. So now I can just glue this onto the backer and this template will be done. Okay, and I gotta make sure it's parallel to the template backer, which will make it easier to align it later on. With a tapered template, how far back the follower is on the template matters a lot. And I found my template was a little bit skewed, so you can see the follower is further from the backer than it is here. So this frame is crooked a little bit and I need to move it that way. So I've loosened the screws down here and I'm just going to put a shim in here and tighten the screws, and that should bring it this way a little bit and make that more parallel. So that tenon fits really nice, but I think I have probably about 1/4 millimeters worth of play, so let's make it slightly bigger. Just a tiny bit of friction. Perfect. And that's not tear out right there. I'm just using a used 2x4, so that's a nail hole.